Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. I am so very excited. This is my YouTube live. This is a new medium for me. I'm so used to standing in front of a room of people and talking to them. But it's so wonderful to be here and to be interacting with you, my community of learners, people who are on this journey with me. Very welcome to the session. I hope that you can hear me and you can see me. And if you can, please, could you send something in the chat to let me know that the audio and video is working fine for you? I would be ever so grateful if you could just confirm that for me. There is a live chat function as well here for you to use. So yes, assalamu alaikum once again. I'm sure people will be joining in the next few minutes. Yes, I've had confirmation that this is all working fine. Thank you very much, Nasira. Really appreciate that. Thank you. I think it is definitely worth just doing a brief introduction around who I am. For those of you who have been part of my channel for a period of time, you would know that I am a researcher in the field of Islamic finance with broader interest in Islamic law or Islamic jurisprudence. I am particularly fascinated with the field of usul al-fiqh, as we call it, which is the science of interpretation of Islamic sources, the principles through which we understand our religion. And it's a really beautiful knowledge tradition and an absolutely fascinating one. And my day job, which pays my bills very nicely, for which I'm very grateful, I'm head of operations in a department in a university. So that's kind of my bread and butter is leadership and management and strategy and financial planning. So that's kind of my day job. So the research and thinking and all of the YouTube work happens on an evening or on the weekend outside of work hours. And I know it's been a bit quiet on my end for the last few weeks because I was busy writing a research paper. There was a conference in Cambridge where I was presenting. So headspace was at a premium. But alhamdulillah, that went really well. I really enjoyed the experience. I actually have another conference to attend next week. And then inshallah, I'd be able to give a lot more time to my YouTube channel. So thank you so much for being patient with me. When I sent the call out, I received lots of questions. So I already have those questions in front of me, which I can go through. But for my audience here, and I can see 6 people in the room, you are very welcome to post questions now. I will read through them. I am keeping an eye on the chat. So please feel free to do that. Do also let me know where you're tuning in from. It's amazing through the internet we can connect globally. So do let me know where you're based. That would be that would be good for me to know where my audience are. That would be really wonderful. So yes, feel free to post questions in here. And I will start with the list I have just to get the ball rolling because I'm here for an hour. I'm around, but I want to make sure that everyone who's here can make the most of this hour that they have with me. Oh, I have just received greetings from the Swiss Alps. That's absolutely lovely. You're very, very lucky. Mashallah, very blessed to live in such a beautiful region. I don't know what the weather is like for you, but we have had scorching heat in Britain, which is very unusual. And as a Pakistani who escaped from the heat, I've just been sat here wondering, oh my God, is it going to just get as hot here in Britain? But we have, alhamdulillah, had a little bit of rain now for the last couple of days, which is helping replenish all the water reservoirs because Britain depends on rain. And if the rain stops, we very quickly go into a period of drought. So welcome, Anya, from the Swiss Alps. Let me just look at my list of questions. So when I look away from the screen, I'm actually just looking at my Word document where I've got the questions listed down. One of the first questions I received when I sent the call out for YouTube Live was a question about free will. And it felt to me that the question actually came from a place of pain. Because this was a young person on whose behalf somebody had asked this question about free will. What is it that is in our control? And it seemed that there was some background there around suffering or crisis that the question had emerged from. And I think when we are in a period of crisis or suffering, this can become a very difficult question to answer, because we might feel very trapped by our circumstances. We might feel very, very claustrophobic. There may be lots of constraints on our circumstances, emotional constraints, financial constraints, situational constraints. And so we can feel that things are spiraling out of control and we can feel quite overwhelmed by that. And there is so much study out now that psychologists and psychotherapists and psychiatrists have done, which is that when human beings lose that sense of control, they can feel very overwhelmed and distressed. And chronic stress and distress can then make us quite unwell. So, how do we explain free will and divine predestination? That was the question that was posed to me. So, if everything is decreed by Allah, if Allah knows everything, and if everything is in His control, because we believe that He's omnipotent, then what's the point of saying that human beings have free will? And I remember being troubled by the same question myself when I was a teenager. And I still distinctly remember sitting at our dining table having breakfast and asking my father the same question. And I think my question was more in the context of, people who do palm reading, they look at your palm, the lines on your palm, and they tell you that, you're going to marry once, or you're going to marry twice, or you will have 3 children, or you'll be rich, or you'll be poor. And you think, okay, if everything's written in the palm of my hand, what is the point of my exercising free will? What choices do I have? And it kind of reminded me of that moment when I was also grappling with this question. I think that the question needs unpacking a little bit, and some Quranic principles can help guide our way, and also some of our personal experiences as well. I'll start with the personal experience just to illustrate some of the complexity here. A close friend of mine, this is a few years ago, he was out of work and he had been unemployed for a significant period of time. And, being somebody that his family was looking up to provide financially, as you can imagine, he was carrying a lot of pressure. And he was applying for jobs, and he got this job interview at a very good organization. So we checked in with him and asked him how his interview went. And he said that he never went to the interview because he was asleep. And so we queried that and we said, well, why did you not go to your job interview? And the response we got back from him, and he came from the Al-Hadith school of thought, was that he did not go to his job interview because everything's decreed by God. And if his rizq, his sustenance is going to reach him, that is going to reach him anyway, because that would be predestined for him. It would be written in his taqdeer, in his destiny. And we found that quite baffling, and I found that quite baffling, because it seems now there's a misunderstanding between what the general laws and principles that Allah has set in motion. So this universe is not arbitrary. It has not been created in an arbitrary fashion. This universe has certain laws. Societies have certain laws and rules and regulations. There are certain things we need to do, even in nature. So an example could be that if a lion just sits in its den, is it going to be fed or not? Or does the lion have to go out and hunt for prey so it can feed? And so the universal law here is that, yes, a predator like a lion has to go out and hunt and feed because the food will not come to him. Well, there may be a deer that strays past the lion's den and he grabs it, but he would still have to get up and grab the deer and hunt for it. So there's a question here about what is in our control and what is not in our control. One of the really beautiful things in the Quran that illustrates this is in Surah Yusuf. I'm sure that you would have read Surah Yusuf. It is one of the most beautiful and most detailed stories told in the Quran, and there are very many lessons here. And one of the in one of the verses, it always strikes me, and it strikes me because I was reading the translation a few years ago, and I realized how Prophet Yaqub alayhi salam had positioned his response to a crisis. So as you know, Prophet Yaqub alayhi salam had 12 sons. Prophet Yusuf, or Joseph, was his beloved son, and he went out with his brothers. His brothers were envious of the fact that the father loved Yusuf so much, and they threw him down a well. And then they came back to their father and said that he had been eaten by a wolf, and they showed him Yusuf's bloodied shirt. So they must have put some blood on it. And Prophet Yaqub is absolutely grief-stricken when that happens. And his response then is, A, not to believe the story that his sons are telling him, but then B, he says, and I quote from the Quran, for sabrun jameel. For me, there is beautiful patience. And what is beautiful about the way this is written is that Prophet Yaqub chooses beautiful patience in what must be an extremely distressing situation. For a parent to lose their child is one of the nightmares that a parent has. And he says that he chooses beautiful patience in a moment of crisis. So even when we're in the middle of profound crisis, we can choose how to respond to that crisis. And people respond differently. Psychologists study this. So there would be examples where children have gone through prolonged periods of abuse, and some children come out intact and they don't repeat the cycle of abuse, whereas others are completely broken by it. So circumstances, personalities, opportunities, various things play a part. But from our point of view as Muslims who come from a position of faith and faith in God, we always think about turning to God and turning towards hope and choosing patience. And patience, therefore, is not a passive acceptance of a situation. Patience is active, radical acceptance of a situation. It is something we choose. The other thing I want to say is that Allah tells us in the Quran that He does not test us beyond our endurance. There is a very beautiful section of a verse in Surah Al-Baqarah, "Rabbana wa la tuhammilna ma la taqata lana bihi." We can pray to God and say, "My Lord, do not test me beyond my endurance, do not burden me beyond my endurance." And so this is the position, the faith position that we have as Muslims. Um, I want to then just very briefly add the idea of predestination. I think sometimes you get confused between predestination and free will, is because we can forget that the sense of time that we experience as humans is very different from the sense of time that Allah has. Allah's sense of time is completely different from ours. He can see all of time. He can see the past, the present, the future. He can see what was the past to the past. He can see prior to what we see as past, and he can see all the way into the future, into eternity, and we can't. So we experience time as a linear process. There are things that happen in the past, there are things happening now, but we have no idea what the future holds. But Allah knows exactly what the future holds. So he has a record of that because he's able to accurately record that, but he hasn't shared that knowledge with us. So the fact that I'm ignorant about my future means that all possibilities are open to me. And this is where the whole point about moral choice comes in, that even in difficult situations, if we make a moral choice, we're rewarded for it. And if we make an immoral or unethical choice, then we are held accountable for it. And therefore, the idea of accountability in the Quran can only work if we believe that human beings have free will, although we appreciate that there are some circumstances beyond our control, like who will be given life, who will be given illness, the loss of a child. And Allah says that actually, that He tests us through trials and tribulations. Illness, hunger, poverty, they can happen to anyone. We can't predict what life would be like, but we can choose how we respond to it. And it reminds me of a nice thing I read in Stephen R. Covey's book, Seven Habits of Highly Effective People. I read this many decades ago as a teenager. And in one of the chapters, he talks about the power of understanding that between stimulus and response, we have the freedom to choose. So even when the stimulus is negative, we can choose how we respond to it. And this is what is beautifully captured in Surah Yusuf, when Prophet Yaqub alayhi salam says, "For sabrun jameel," for me, it's beautiful patience. So I hope that this helps shed some light on the idea of predestination. There is no such thing as predestination. God has not predestined a course of action for us. He knows. He has full knowledge of the course of action we will take. He has full knowledge of the choices we make. He puts us through trials and tribulations to test us. We don't have the knowledge of what job we're going to get, whether we'll be beset by a crisis in 3 months or 6 months' time, whether some doors will close on us or some other doors will open. And therefore, we exercise free will in response to even those circumstances which may be beyond our control. So if I set out for my job interview, I can try my best to give a very good job interview, be on time, dress smartly, and do my preparation. But if the job is not meant to be, then I accept the fact that the job is not meant for me. And inshallah, Allah will give me something better, because rizq is in His hands, but going out to the job interview is in my hands. So I hope that this helps shed some light on the idea of free will and predestination. So lovely. We're about 14 minutes in. I've got 8 people in the room. Thank you so much for joining me. Assalamu alaikum to those of you who've joined me just now. There is a live chat function here for you. I have a list of questions I'm going through, but please feel free to add questions into the live chat. Feel free to share your reactions and appreciation and disagreements. Right. I have a question from Nasira. How do you define justice? Right now, we see a lot of injustices in the world. How a common Muslim should work to achieve justice? Nasira, what you've asked is, in my view, the most important question of today, because what we are seeing is a moment of rupture in the world. Since 7th October 2023, that is a watershed moment. We have seen a live genocide unfold on our screens, and we've sat here watching helpless. And the rupture isn't just happening there in Palestine. The rupture is also happening across the democratic world, where extreme, obscene levels of wealth are now eating up democracy. So oligarchy has taken over democracy. The rule of international law has broken down, and all of those global institutions that we looked towards to establish justice, those institutions have been rendered impotent. So that just tells you that institutions are only as powerful as the trust we put in them, A, and B, the fact that we continue to strengthen them and respect those institutions. If we don't respect those institutions, then those institutions are going to become impotent. If we don't respect the rule of law, then the rule of law will break down. So it is a very profound moment in human history. And, it's, I think the last couple of years have really shaken up all of the certainties that we have held for a long time. So, what is justice? In the Quran, there are two words used for the concept of justice. One is adl. Adl is, and I'm going to use Raymond Harvey's explanation here. He's written a book about Quran and justice, so you can read that book. Raymond Harvey says that adl is an inner quality of justice. So it is our internal sense of fairness. When we treat our children equally, for example, we're trying to be fair as a parent. That's adl. And then there is qist, which is the other word used in the Quran. And the Quran says continuously and in many different places that Muslims must stand for, believers must stand forth in justice. Believers must uphold justice. There are some examples of economic justice in the Quran as well, where, for example, for Prophet Shoaib's nation, as you know, when he was sent to his nation, people used to cheat in weights and measures, so they wouldn't weigh things properly when they were selling them. So that's financial justice, that when we are doing any financial or commercial dealings or transactions, then we need to be just and fair in those transactions. But the idea of qist is a lot more than that. And the Quran consistently asks us to stand forth in justice. Even if it's against ourselves, it wants us to bear witness to the truth. So justice is, according to many scholars, justice and compassion are the two key values in the Quran, the two top values in the Quran, justice and compassion. So as Muslims, then it means A, bearing witness to the truth. So we should always be inculcating in us an ethical and moral sense of what is right and what is wrong in ourselves, in our children, in our families, in our circle of influence. Second, that we must try within our constraints to raise our voice against injustices. Third, that we should not become part of injustice or systems that are unjust. And even if we are part of a system which is overall unjust, then we should try to bring reform to that system. So we shouldn't just accept that things are the way they are. For example, so many economists politicians rather, accept that poverty just is. But actually, poverty is not a natural state of being, and states and societies have responsibility to eradicate poverty. And you see that in the Quran, where the Quran says again and again that the poor have right on the wealth of the rich, pay your zakat, do your infaq. So the Quran takes a very broad and beautiful view of justice. I think your question is also about defining justice. And this is controversial, what I'm about to say, because orthodoxy would say that justice is how justice was understood in 7th century Hijaz when the Quran was revealed. And so we would then, you could imagine then within those social conditions, certain forms of justice held. I'll give you an example. It was considered perfectly just for people who had done mischief in the land, so, terrorism or muharba, that they could be crucified. That was a form of punishment. So bear with me. And so it would be considered just that, eye for an eye was considered just, qisas was considered just, crucifying people or exiling them was considered just, because those were the forms of punishment extant in that society. So I would pose you a question now: would we now psychologically accept that as a way of meting out justice. I don't think we will. So the form in which justice is given out has changed. What has also changed is the society's understanding of social relations. So, for example, in the Quranic times, slavery was extant in society. And even though the Quran makes it a very high form of charity to set a slave free, there are no verses in the Quran that prohibit slavery. So now that the institution of slavery formally has ended in the world, in the 19th century, slavery was abolished. We know that the transatlantic slave trade was abolished. We know that informal forms of slavery still exist. So human trafficking happens, sex trafficking happens, there's bonded labor. We know that slavery exists informally, but as a legal institution, it has ended. And so our sense of justice now has changed. So it may have been considered just in 7th century Hijaz to have 2 or 3 slaves working for you in the household, but we are no longer going to consider it just. And so I suppose what I'm saying is that our sense of justice is dynamic. Our sense of justice is related to our epistemology, our ethical sensibilities, our aesthetic sensibilities, the sum total of knowledge that we have, the technological progress that we have seen, the economic progress we have seen, all of that changes our definitions of justice. So justice emerges as a dynamic concept. Even in the Quran, it emerges as a dynamic concept because the Quran has a gradual process of legal change over the period of 23 years, roughly, that it was revealed in. This lands very badly with Orthodox Muslims, because they want to define justice exactly how justice was defined 1400 years ago, or it was defined 1200 or 1100 years ago, but by our classical scholars, and they stick to those definitions of justice. This is one of the reasons why we find so much of Islamic law, classical Islamic law, inapplicable to our times. And so if somebody says that, a woman must obey her husband because that's justice, we say, no, it's not, because the idea of obedience does not land nicely with us. Whereas when the Quran was being revealed, there was a patronage system in households. I mean, actually, Karen Boyer and Firaz Hamza have recently published a book, Women in Households, something about the patronage system. You can look up the book, and one of the arguments they make there is that women were financially and physically needed the protection of men to survive. So women could not survive without the protection of men, male protection. And there was a system of patronage in those households. And in that system of patronage, actually, a level of obedience was expected from slaves who were owned and from women who depended on those men. This is also one of the reasons why in the Quran, a man could give divorce to his wife, but a woman had to ask for annulment. Now, people see that as unjust or unfair, but actually women had to seek annulment because the process needed to be a bit long-winded and consulted upon, so you could find other form of patronage and protection for the woman. Because if she detached herself from her husband, where would she go? And a lot of women, because of war or because of social unrest, ended up in slavery, prostitution. So those are very difficult times. I suppose in my long answer, what I'm saying is that definitions of justice change. Orthodoxy is not comfortable with that. But from my study of the Quran and the process of legal change that we find in the Quran, and I'm not alone in saying that, a lot of other reformist scholars have said that. Fazlur Rahman has said this as well, that we need to rework what the hikmah of the Quranic law is according to our definitions of justice. And I'll say this and finish off, one of the definitions of justice we have today is what we call equal rights, which is enshrined in the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights. And so men and women are considered equal. In Afghanistan, where women are being oppressed, the activists working on the ground have taken the case to the UN and said that Afghanistan now has gender apartheid. It's a society where women are systematically being erased from society. So it doesn't land well with us when women are not given the same level of humanity and legal agency that men have, because we now believe, because we've grown up in a world where human rights are understood and accepted, that men and women are equal. So we believe in gender equality, and that is one of the definitions of justice that we follow. So I hope, Nasra, that this has helped shed some light. I wish more Muslims asked that question, and I wish that more Muslims actually studied this so we could come up with more dynamic ways of re-engaging with the Quran and finding our definitions of justice. I hope that's helped. Unless I receive any more questions in the chat, I'm going to go back to my list of questions. The next one I have in the list was around, and this is an easy enough question to answer. Why did Dhul-Qarnayn kill the young boy? This is the incident in Surah Kahf. Just want to say very quickly, just to correct that it was not Dhul-Qarnayn. Dhul-Qarnayn is one of the very just kings who's mentioned in the Quran in Surah Al-Kahf. It is actually the person that Musa alayhi salam was traveling with and taking moral guidance from. Hadith literature tells us his name was Khidr, or Khizr as we call it in Urdu. There is no name mentioned in the Quran, but it seems that he was a man of God and a prophet of God, and he received revelation from God. Musa alayhi salam was traveling with him, and during those travels, Khidr actually kills a young boy, and Musa alayhi salam questions him. It's a fascinating paragraph. Do read it. It's all about being patient about God's decree and being patient about God's decisions, because there is hikmah, rationale behind God's decisions, which we sometimes don't understand in the moment, but in retrospect, things become clearer to us. The boy was killed, by the way, because Khidr alayhi salam believed that the boy would become a very evil person, and he would be a trial for his parents, and he would be kind of a menace to society. And he says that he's made that decision because God has instructed him. So he's very clear that this isn't something he's doing out of his own volition. He's actually following Allah's orders. The next question I have is around backbiting, which is backbiting in Islam. In Islam, the Quran takes a very, very dim view of backbiting and prohibits us from doing that. So there are two things that we require to do as Muslims. One, what we know as husn dhan, which is that we should think positively about other people and their intentions. And so we should treat them positively rather than thinking negatively about them or being doubtful. And the other is to not do backbiting. So it's compared with eating the flesh of your brother. What that means is that you're saying negative things or slanderous things about somebody who's not present amongst you, and he or she's not able to defend himself. As you would know, there's an entire gossip industry, magazines. I purposefully don't read them. I'm not interested in which celebrity did not text another celebrity and what does that mean for their marriage. I don't care. There's an entire gossip industry, thriving gossip industry. So capitalism has kind of honed in on that and making a lot of money from it. Now, this is not to say that if we have been treated badly by somebody, that we can't air our grievance. If we have been treated badly by somebody, we should air our grievance with the person who has misbehaved towards us. Sometimes in financial dealings, people cheat you and that trust is damaged. We shouldn't then be going around saying to everybody that this person's untrustworthy. But if another person comes to you for advice around investing with that person, you might say, look, I've had a bad experience. So we can absolutely share facts of an experience, but not to slander about somebody, to malign their character, or to gossip about them. One of the defining characteristics of gossip is that it is based on assumptions about people, not knowing reality, and it is the assumptions we build on. So we say things like, oh, did you see how she was dressed that the other day? This is a woman of loose moral character. That kind of slander is absolutely forbidden in Islam, and we should stay away from that. The next question on my list, again, it's a quick one, so I'll answer that before I come to the chat because I can see some questions in the chat. This one is about, the question is, should we always eat from the right hand even if we are left-handed? The answer is yes. So eating from the right hand is actually part of our deen. It's part of our religion. This knowledge has traveled down to us from Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, from the Sahaba, and through the generations of Muslims. So our mothers actually teach us to eat from the right hand. We should eat from the right hand, but there is no strictness in Islam around using the left hand, for example, to write. So some people are born left-handed, and that would be their dominant hand. And if they use that to write, to type, whatever other tasks they perform, to iron their clothes, absolutely fine. It's not a problem. But when it comes to eating, saying Bismillah before we start eating is obligatory, and also eating from the right hand is obligatory. And this is something that can be taught easily. I know in Christianity, there was a period of time when children who were born left-handed were seen as demonic, and they were punished, very badly punished. There, no such concept exists in Islam. If a child wants to write from the left hand, absolutely, that's not a problem at all. Right, I shall now come to the chat. I can see there are 12 people in the room. This is really lovely, by the way. I did not expect so many of you to come in. I really appreciate that. I know how busy everyone is. So, Nasira, your question next. Can you explain your interpretation of beating wife verse in Surah Nisa? Yes, I suggest, Nasira, that you watch my video that I recorded with Iram Saeed and Lina Al Ali. This was a few months ago, where we delve into the verse in huge amounts of detail. By the way, we took 3 hours. So it's in 3 parts. It's on Iram Saeed's channel. Please do have a look through that because of the level of detail in there, so you can understand. I will just very briefly say it is impossible for us to accommodate wife beating into the moral framework of the Quran. The Quran does not allow parents to beat their children. The Quran does not even allow people to beat their slaves or to mistreat them. And the words that the Quran uses for marriage are beautiful words: sakina, tranquility. It uses the word mawadda, rahma, shura, consultation, affection, compassion towards your spouse. How can the Quran then allow something as demeaning as beating an adult person? Is just completely against the moral framework of the Quran. And I cannot condemn enough those scholars who have allowed domestic violence to be sanctioned. It's like instrumentalizing the Quran to commit injustice and harm towards other people. How can we use the Quran? This is an abuse of the Quran. It is violence to the Quran. So, no, this is not allowed. The verse in particular talks about women committing nushuz in the form of fahisha. In other words, a woman having an affair and committing adultery. And the latter half of the verse actually addresses the community, or the people in authority or elders in the community, who are told to take disciplinary action against a wife who's committed adultery. And that disciplinary action, of course, would have to follow due process or legal process. What we cannot accommodate is any interpretation that the husband, who's the wronged party, can be the judge, jury, and executioner. So not only is he angry, he's allowed to express his anger through hitting his wife. We cannot accept any interpretations like that. So it would be for the community to decide what to do if a woman commits nushuz. And nushuz, by the way, is about repeated poor behavior. It is repeated rising up. It isn't just a one-off incident. And we're talking about a very serious crime here, which is adultery. The next one is Salam. I have a personal question. Family are currently using a conventional mortgage with a fixed rate of interest. They were previously on an Islamic mortgage, but found it to be more expensive. Islamic mortgages are very expensive. I'll come to Islamic mortgages and Islamic finance in a moment, because I've received a couple of other questions. So I hope that you're happy to wait. Let me just make a note so I don't forget. The next one from Rubina. Salam wassalam, Rubina. You've asked, can you talk about inheritance distribution in Islam, please? Rubina, I will talk about it very briefly, because inheritance is an area where I need to do a lot more research. But I will talk to you from my understanding that I have now. The inheritance verses appear repeatedly in Surah An-Nisa, and I suggest that you read Surah An-Nisa, just the translation, over a period of a couple of days. Just read the whole thing from start to end. You will find that in Surah An-Nisa, Allah says repeatedly, leave a bequest, leave a will. So he's asking Muslims to leave a will. And Allah says that when you leave a will, think about manfaya. So manfaya is benefit, or benefit to the household, or utility to the household. So for example, if I am going to be dependent on somebody in my old age, or if I have a young child who still has to go through university, I might want to leave more money for that child because they're going to need that money. Or I might leave more money for a child who's going to pick up care or responsibility for elderly parents or somebody else. Or for a daughter, for example, who's widowed and she needs access to capital, to inheritance, to make ends meet. So we have been given the right to write a will. And the Quran repeatedly insists that we write a will. The problem that's happened is that our ulama have not insisted on that bit of the verse, which is to encourage Muslims to write a will. So many Muslims don't write a will. Then the Quran says that if you haven't written a will, if you don't have a will, then whatever's left over is now going to be apportioned according to these percentages that God has given. So, looking at the social structure of that time, because men had the responsibility to provide, they were given more of the inheritance. But that happens only after whatever's left over from the will. It's this balance that has been messed up. And what has been enshrined in law in many Muslim countries is that whatever estate somebody leaves behind, that is apportioned according to those fractions given in the Quran. Twice as much for sons and half as much for daughters, and a little bit for dads and a little bit for mum. And if you don't have children, then it goes to your siblings. So those proportions have been turned into law, but the bit before, which is about leaving a bequest, hasn't. So this is my understanding, that we should leave a bequest. And if we have a son and a daughter, and we think that their circumstances are such that they're both going to equally benefit, then we should leave a will for them where they equally benefit. Whatever's then left behind can be apportioned accordingly. But inshallah, I will do more research on this, and I do want to record a video on it where I will delve into it in more detail. But I hope, Rubina, that it gives some sort of an answer. I then have another question about multiple views on home ownership through Islamic mortgage schemes. We also know that commercial banks have been seen to have links to injustice through the world, for example, Barclays. Yes, again, a really good question. I'll come back to Islamic mortgages in a moment. Rubina's next question is, can a wife get half of the estate and then her allocated share as well? It depends on the local laws and where you live. In Western countries, mostly, if a divorce happens, then the wife gets half. If the husband dies, then the assets do transfer over to the wife if there is joint ownership. So, for example, the house that I live in is in joint ownership between me and my husband. So if, God forbid, something happens to him, it transfers over to me, and vice versa. If something happens to me, it transfers over to him. In other countries, the law might be very different. Now, when you're talking about the estate and the allocated share, I think you're talking about the inheritance share as well. Again, that would depend on the situation and whatever legal contract exists. So it's not easy to answer these questions because they vary so much on a case-by-case basis. But inshallah, I will do a video on inheritance, and then I'll pick up kind of the more general approaches to that. I will now come to the questions on Islamic finance and Islamic mortgages. What I call the established juridical opinion. So this is the popular opinion amongst Muslim communities and Muslim scholars. Okay, so that's why it's the established opinion, is that bank interest is riba. I'm sure many of you, if you can also do some emojis and react for me, I'm sure many of you have heard this, that bank interest is haram, conventional banking is haram, and we should not take out any loans from banks, etc. Now, so many Muslims, entrepreneurs who want to expand their businesses, don't do that because they think that they're delving into something haram by taking out a bank loan. So many people can't afford to buy houses, or they're living on rent and they're not choosing to buy houses because they think that bank interest is haram. This is a very controversial opinion. Even though it is popular, it doesn't mean that it's accepted by all scholars. There are very many scholars who have questioned this definition of riba, including myself. So my thesis was on the definition of riba. I will put a link to the thesis when I upload this video. So you can, if you want, theses are not fun to read, but you can read sections of it, whatever you find relevant. And inshallah, I will turn that into a book. So Fazl Rahman, Abdullah Saeed, Muhammad Umar Farooq, myself, so many scholars have questioned and critiqued this idea that bank interest is riba. When you go into the Quran and the socio-historical circumstance of the Quran, this is what I've done in my thesis, is that I've gone right back to the economies of antiquity, so ancient economies. I have looked at what is it that Arabs were doing at the time the Quran was revealed. Okay, now often our Orthodox scholars don't delve into history, and there are complex reasons for that. But I don't think that you can really understand the Quran until you understand the circumstances in which it was initially revealed, because then you can work out what the moral principles are that the Quran is trying to tell its addressees and train its addressees in. So when the Quran was revealed, the Qurayshi merchants of Makkah and of Medina, the rich people in Medina, used to trade using forms of partnership contracts. Okay, they were called mudaraba. So many Islamic banks still use them. I don't think that that form of contract is useful, but they still use them because they think they're Islamic. The Arabs used to use then if they had any spare wealth, what they would do is they would give out that money to needy people for consumption loans. So consumption loans are loans where you are in need. Okay, so you have been afflicted by something like famine, your crop has failed, or your wife has become very unwell and she can't work on the farm with you, and so you're not able to realize the same kind of farming profits or yield, or your child has become unwell. It's always driven by consumption or need. Those people would go to the rich merchants who had spare wealth and they would ask for a loan, and the Arabs would give them a loan. And then if the loan was not paid back on time and the person came to them, the borrower came to them and said, look, could you give me, at, let's say, another 3 months to pay back the loan? What they would do is they would double the loan. And this practice is actually mentioned in the Quran in Surah Al-Imran. This is verse 130, where Allah says, do not consume, do not eat riba doubled and multiplied. So if I owed 1 kilo of dates to somebody, that would become 2 kilos of dates to give back. If I owed 100 dinar to somebody, they would become 200 dinars. So the debt would multiply so fast that people would not be able to repay. Then consequences would set in. Because, by the way, if you look at the history of usury or riba, you always find in there poverty, difficult circumstances, destitution, violence, and slavery. So a couple of things would happen. One, the lender, because they had the power to do so, they would take away valuables from the borrower, because the borrower couldn't pay the loan back. They would come in and they would take away their cattle. They would take away, the Torah, in fact, even mentions that they would take away people's warm garments because clothing was so expensive. So people would only have, let's say, one warm thing to wear. And in the Torah, in Exodus, Allah actually says, do not be like a usurer to the poor. And if you take their garment as a pledge, return it to them at sundown. Otherwise, how will they sleep? They will get cold. And so they would take away people's valuables, their jewels, if they had any, their cattle. In some cases, they would take away their millstone. This is what you grind wheat with to make bread. So they would take away their ability to eat. In some cases, they would take over their orchards, or they would pledge their orchards as a loan and say, you can no longer sell the fruit from the orchard. We will consume the fruit from the orchard. So it's riba was an extremely exploitative system. Now, if the person still could not pay back debts, they would actually take that person into slavery. They would even take their families into slavery. This was called debt peonage, or today it's called bonded labor. And so your entire family and your future generations keep trying to work to pay off the debt, but they're never able to pay off the debt. That was the reality of riba. This is what the Quran is talking about. There was no bank interest in those times because banks did not exist. The Quran was revealed in the 7th century. The first banking institutions emerged in Italy in the 13th century, so roughly 600 years after the Quran. So when the Arabs used interest, when I say interest, this form of doubling where the debt multiplies very fast, so the interest rate is 50 or 100% or 200%, that was only done in the case of consumption loans or loans to the poor or loans to the needy. This is also why when you read the Quran, every time riba is mentioned, it is mentioned in the context of charity or infaq. So Allah is saying, those people who deserve charity from you, rather than giving them charity, you're actually taking riba from them. You're extracting profit from them. And this is why in Surah Al-Baqarah, where there is a long, detailed set of verses from, I think, verse 265 onwards or verse 245 onwards, Allah talks about infaq. I think it's 265 onwards. He talks about infaq or charity, those deserving of charity, condemns riba, and then says that if your borrower wants more time, give him time. And if he cannot pay you back, then just remit the loan, just write it off. Don't take interest from him and then write off the principal, because that would be the highest form of charity, because riba is zulm. So the Quran says that riba is injustice, and we can see why it's injustice. So this is the Quranic view of riba, and it's corroborated through hadith tradition, it's corroborated through historical evidence. That's been my research. Now then, Why do our scholars say that bank interest is riba? Because they've picked out the definition of riba from classical law, particularly the definition given by Abu Bakr al-Jassas, who was a great Hanafi scholar of the 10th century. And he said that any pre-stipulated increase on a loan is riba. So they've taken that definition, which he had written in his social context, social economic context, moved it forward to our times and said that bank interest is riba. Okay. So this is what's happened. That view has become popular, and all Muslims now say that bank interest is riba. And I would say it isn't. Most regulated bank interest is not riba. Uh, some forms of bank interest can become riba. That's a technical thing, but I can explain that in a longer video. But most forms of bank interest, reasonable bank interest, is not riba. The forms of riba in our time is village loan sharks. So these are people who prowl the streets, and they know that if a family in a particular street or a village is in distress, then they would give them money at very high rates of interest, or they would give them money at zero interest and take away their valuables from them as a pledge. This is very common, especially in poor countries where people don't have access to credit, regulated banking. So they would go to these loan sharks. Feudalism is a form of riba, where feudal landlords uh, do not give agricultural inputs to tenant farmers, and the tenant farmers have to borrow money from them. So they keep them into a form of slavery. Bonded labor in South Asia, you will be shocked to hear that there are 15 million people in bonded labor in India and Pakistan. This is a form of riba. So these are the forms of riba, if we look at the Quranic definition that we have today. Payday lending in countries like the UK, payday lending is still allowed. The UK has no usury statutes, no usury laws. So payday lenders can charge 500% to 1,000% in interest, even 1,500% in interest. So the interest rate is so high, you can never really repay the loan. So these are the forms of riba we have. Now that I've set this out, I can now come to your question. If somebody wants to take out a loan from a conventional bank for a mortgage, please do so. The banks, the loans that Islamic banks give are also based on interest. The calculations are the same. I remember I was teaching my Islamic finance class at University of Leeds, and I did an Excel spreadsheet for them, and I calculated the loan payments for them. And the loan payments from an Islamic bank in the UK and a non-Islamic conventional bank were exactly the same. The same rate of interest, the market rate of interest is being used. So they use the same rate of interest. But what Islamic banks do is they have a very complicated legal transaction, the musharaka. Usually they use the musharaka for an Islamic mortgage. Because it's a complicated transaction, the transaction costs are very high. Lawyers have to be involved. Lots of paperwork has to be done. That increases the cost of the mortgage. So Islamic mortgages become more expensive because of the way they're structured. And I think it is really unfair to ask Muslims to bear already the economic situation is so dire across the world, and to ask people to bear an additional financial burden because they want to be true to their faith. I personally see that as exploitative. So I would say the mortgage system in conventional banks is perfectly fine. Why it's not exploitative? Because they check your affordability. So they come to talk to you about what your income is, what your expenses are, how many dependents do you have, what deposit can you put down. If you want to buy a house, can you afford the mortgage payments or not? And if you can't afford them, then they will give you the house. Now, you can also say that conventional banking needs some reform and it can be made fairer. Yes, conventional banking is not perfect. It can be made fairer. However, conventional mortgages are not, it's wrong to say that conventional mortgages are haram. The related question then was around injustice and links to banks and commercial banks. Almost the entire financial system would have some level of corruption or unethical conduct. In America, we had subprime mortgages about in 2007 and 8, which led the market to crash. They were completely unethical. Some banks are invested in industries which are destructive to the climate. Some banks are invested in industries which are selling arms to aggressor nations, and all of that's unethical. We can choose not to bank with those banks. And absolutely, if you know that a bank's general practices are unethical, please don't bank with them. Your deposits are valuable. These are your deposits, your hard earned money. Please put them in a bank which is ethical. Lots of conventional banks now adopt ethical banking policies. So you can choose from them or you can choose from an Islamic bank. That's entirely up to you. So I hope that answers the question. Arifa Sadaf, Walaikum Assalam. I think you joined us at absolutely the right point where I was answering the question about riba. So I hope that has answered your question. You've then asked about certain saving schemes by governments where you deposit some money and they will get profit on that after a specified period of time. Please elaborate if this is riba. No, it is not. The money is invested in a productive venture. That venture gives you a return. That return is shared. There is no problem with that. So I want to encourage Muslims, especially Muslim women, to please save and invest safely, because it is really important. The next question was from Rubina. Is wuzu okay with nail polish on? Yes. Nail polish only became a problem, I think, in the late 1950s. When somebody, I can't remember the name, wrote a fatwa about nail polish. It was a man who wrote it. There is no problem at all with wearing nail polish. I love how capitalism hones in on these things, and there is now an entire halal nail polish industry. I don't see the point of that. When somebody puts on nail polish, their nails are clean. It's absolutely fine. There is nothing in the Quran or the Sunnah that says that every micro inch of our body, bits of our body have to be washed with water. Generally, most of us have access to indoor plumbing. We keep our hands clean. We have hand wash, soap. If you've got nail polish on, has no impact whatsoever on your wudu or your prayer. So I would rather that we say our prayers than become so stressed and worried about wearing nail polish that takes us away from prayer. So yeah, it's a complete non-issue, and it's one of those things where it's deliberately been turned into an issue, and it's taking so much headspace and emotions, creating so much emotional stress for Muslim women. They're just so worried about the iman all the time. And from my perspective, this is a non-issue. Sharia is not interested in our nails. Now, if our nails were extreme, very long or unhygienic, that's a problem, because trimming our nails is part of the sunnah of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We should keep our nails trimmed, and we also shouldn't wear the kind of nails that some celebrities wear, which are kind of done to make a particular point or to seek a lot of wrong attention. Those practices are not okay. However, wearing nail polish is not a problem. So I hope that helps answer the question. I'm going to quickly go back to my document now in the last few minutes, unless something else pops up in the chat. There was a question posted a couple of days ago about how can Muslim women understand 4 marriages. I would respond to that by saying, why should Muslim women understand 4 marriages? Why are Muslim women expected to accept polygamy? Polygamy is not a Sharia ruling. Islam did not initiate polygamy. Unlimited polygamy already existed at the time the Quran was revealed, okay? Because women were treated as commodities. We have to remember women were not full legal agents and they were treated as commodities. And polygamy was extant in society. What happened in the Quran, it's really interesting, the way the Quran talks about polygamy. In Surah Nisa, in the very first few verses, so just read the first kind of 7, 8 verses or so, you will find that Allah starts by saying that He's created people in pairs. And so the balance and harmony in creation, God's master plan in creation, is to create people in pairs, zawj, right? One man, one woman. It's the same for animals as well. They're created in pairs. This is divine creation. Now, within that master plan, there is an exception made for polygamy. And Allah explains in the Quran why He's made that exception. Allah does not argue from gender. He does not argue from sexual preferences. He's not saying that men like to have 4 women. If you allow female sexuality out of its traditional bounds, women also can have multiple partners, and many women do. So the Quran is not making a case based on gender or essentializing arguments about gender. The Quran is very clear that if you cannot do justice in the wealth of the orphans, then marry from the women among you. So marry their mothers, marry the widowed women, because if you cannot do justice to the wealth of orphans, then bring their mothers into marriage, because they will make sure that their children's rights are upheld, and you will be giving protection to those women. And you're not doing them a favor, you must give them the mahar or the dowry, okay? So you're not doing them a favor. This is not kind of some kind of charity. You have to bring them in as your wives. Why does the Quran do that or make that allowance? Because it's dealing with a major social crisis that emerged when Muslims were defeated in the Battle of Uhud. So, if you look at the chronology of Surah Nisa, you find that these verses were revealed at a time when, in a small community of Muslims, many Muslim men died in battle and there were heavy losses. Now, if those women and children were not given patronage, they would have ended up in slavery. You have to remember that there were two factors behind slavery that created the institution of slavery. One was war, and the other was debt. So they would not have had the protection then to live a life of dignity. So Allah is allowing polygamy, which is why He mentions it as. And if you notice, the Arabic is 1 1 1 1 2 2 3 3 or 4 4. So what Allah is saying is bring as many women in your protection as you can, but the maximum is 4. And then later on in Surah An-Nisa, He says that even though you would want to do justice, the word used is adl, that inner sense of fairness. Even though you would want to be fair to your wives, you're not going to be able to do that. So the Quran is clear that polygamy does not stand the test of justice. And if the Quran is about justice, then this exception is being created to deal with a social crisis. So those verses are very specific. What happened was that our legal tradition generalized those verses and made polygamy a Sharia issue, as if the Quran desired polygamy. It did not desire polygamy. God is saying this is unjust. He himself is saying that, but He's allowing it to deal with the situation to minimize harm in society. So it is a ruling of minimization of harm against those most vulnerable in society, which is orphans and their mothers. This is not about men's sexual preferences. And so Muslim women do not have to accept polygamy. In our societies now, monogamy is the norm. According to the Quran, monogamy is the norm. Remember, God has created us in pairs, a man for a woman for a man. This is the norm. Sometimes polygamy is the solution to some social conditions. In those conditions, I think that's for the Muslim society to discuss and debate with ulama about what is fair. I personally go with the Quranic view, which is that it is impossible to do adl in a polygamous marriage. And because of that, polygamous marriages actually do not align with the moral framework of the Quran. They should always be seen as an allowance under exceptional situations of crisis. It's like the COVID legislation that came in, where we started doing the prayer standing 3 meters away from each other. We spaced out our rows of prayer, and women were told not to go for prayer. Those were exceptional situations. You can't then generalize the COVID situation of prayer and say that prayer must always be done so that people stand 3 or 4 or 8 feet away from them. So we have to think about the polygamy legislation as a bit of legislation dealing with a social crisis situation. I hope that answers the question around more marriages. Rubina's question, can you please also talk about the commands and the general guidelines in the Quran and how to differentiate between them? Rubina, one of the perennial questions in Islamic law, which bit of legislation in the Quran is general, which one is specific? There are various views on that. You will find that our scholars tend to generalize a lot. And sometimes they forget that the Quran is being specific. And the reason why that happens is they don't read the Quran in its totality. So our traditional method of exegesis and our traditional method of understanding of the Quran is to do verse by verse understanding of the Quran. Most scholars approach it like that. But in the last few decades, we have seen more and more work emerge around the coherence of the Quran. Inshallah, I would be running a course as well when my website is ready, where I'll introduce you to theories of coherence of the Quran. The Quran is one coherent whole. It has a moral framework which is completely coherent. It has rational argumentation which is coherent. And because Allah is the most perfect, He knows exactly what words to use to make things clear. So the Quran is in Arabi Mubin, in clear, eloquent Arabic. And in the verses of the Quran, when you read them as coherent text and you connect the verses to other similar verses in the Quran, so that's called intra-textual connections, you actually find a lot of clarity. I'll give you an example. You would have all heard that Muslim women should role model the Ummahatul Mu'mineen and dress like them and confine themselves to their homes. But the Quran is very clear. When you read Surah Al-Ahzab, it will say to you clearly that these verses are for the Prophet's wives. And the Quran says they are not like other women. And so the Quran itself is bringing specificity, what is called takhsis in Islamic law. Takhsis means to make something khas, make it specific. So the Quran itself is saying these verses are specific, but our scholars have lifted those verses, generalized them. And Maulana Maududi has been the most influential, the late Maulana Maududi. As you know, he was a prolific scholar. He was a polemical scholar, very effective in argumentation. And when he wrote the book Parda, that was a game changer. And so this idea became very popular that Muslim women should, pious Muslim women should confine themselves to their house. And actually, those verses were not general verses. It's the same with polygamy. As I've explained, the polygamy verses are very specific, and the rationale for the verses is to do justice in the wealth of the orphans. That makes it specific to a social crisis. Now, we may have different social crises, but at that time, that was the social crisis the Quran was trying to attend to. And so if you ponder on the Quran, you find that the Quran itself tells us where there are universal and general principles and where they're not. I'll give you another final example. We're just coming up to time. In Surah An-Nur, so I've talked about Surah Al-Ahzab, where those verses were specific to the Ummahatul Mu'mineen. If you look at Surah An-Nur, Allah says in Surah An-Nur, say to the believing men and say to the believing women. Now the address of the verse is general to the whole community. Somebody had asked me a brilliant question about justice earlier on. In the Quran, Allah says, لِيَقُومَ النَّاسَ بِالْقِسْطِ, so that human beings stand forth in justice. Here the address is even wider, not just Muslims. لِيَقُومَ النَّاسَ بِالْقِسْطِ. لِيَقُومَ النَّاسِ. Nas is all people. So all people must stand forth in justice. So here the command is going out to all human beings, not just Muslims. So the Quran is beautiful, and the Quran, just if you ponder on it, actually brings huge amounts of clarity around what is the general and specific, although I appreciate that there are areas where we can have disagreements about the general and the specific. But as I've pondered more on the Quran, I've actually found more clarity than confusion. I hope that makes sense. Right, quickly going to go back to my Word document if I've missed anything. No, well, there's a question that's mentioned on my channel a lot. Most frequently asked question on my channel, the word khimar is mentioned in the Quran, therefore we must wear it. I think I'm going to leave you a little bit curious and say that requires delving into epistemology and what is classed as deen. Very quickly to respond and say, just because something's mentioned in the Quran does not make it a commandment. The Quran will use words that indicate a commandment. And the commandment in the case of the khimar verse is to cover the chest. This is in Surah An-Nur. Inshallah, I will be doing a much more detailed video where I will be talking about the epistemology of khimar, the word being mentioned there, and what does the mention of the word mean. But as I've said earlier, the command is for women to cover the chest. Right, we've just come up to an hour, and thank you so much for your engagement, for your fantastic questions. I hope that you have found this hour to be useful. You've got to know me a little bit better as well. I want to thank all of you again for being part of this journey. This started off as a spur of the moment thing a couple of years ago, and I must admit I am enjoying so much taking learning out to the community. I have done community education before for a local charity for about 4 years with Muslim families, and it was absolutely wonderful. And it feels fantastic to be able to do that in the virtual space where I can reach a global audience. Please support my channel. Please talk to people about it. Please ask people to subscribe. The more you support me, the easier it gets for me to put on more courses, to fund the work on my website. And I would hope that what I'm sharing with you is an ethical and justice-oriented understanding of Islam, because I think that is the need of the hour, because us Muslims can play such a profound role on the global stage. We can set a new vision in a broken world, and unfortunately, we're not able to do that. So I'm so interested in empowerment of Muslims, and I'm particularly interested in the empowerment of Muslim women. I have found Muslim women, so many of you are here in this session, I have found you to be the most inspiring and incredibly committed believers. And people don't realize just how much power Muslim women and agency they have in this space. And I think we need to grasp that power and agency and own it. And inshallah, make a great difference. Thank you so much. Jazakallah. Thank you for your engagement. And thank you, Arifa. Yes, definitely. I'm going to do a few more sessions like this. I really enjoyed the interaction today. Wherever you are, I hope you have a lovely evening or morning. And inshallah, watch this space. And please do support my channel and my work. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum.